my name is Tim Malonen. I taught American history for 25 years. And today I want to talk to you about the American Revolution. The most important event in American history. For sure, arguably. I like to say that most American historians think of a big three of events in American history: the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. Again, arguably the most important event in the history of the United States. It's the foundational event. It's the beginning of the nation. And we'll talk about that. However, I want to begin by talking about the causes of the American Revolution. Now, as we discussed in the first chapter of this series, when we talked about history itself, history is composed of events. And we talked about the fact that historians, when they talk about an event in history, they break it down. What we call the anatomy of the historical examination of an event. And again, this is commonsensical. This is one of the things I like about history is commonsensical. The anatomy of an event. The causes, the event itself, and then the consequences of the event. And today I want to talk about the causes of the American Revolution. Now, when we talk about causes, we usually divide causes into two categories. There's proximate or immediate causes, and then there's underlying causes. The metaphor would be that the proximate cause is the spark or the match. The underlying cause is the dry pile of brush. So when we talk about causes of the American Revolution, and here, again, there's very few, as a history teacher I know, there's very few historical facts that everybody in the United States seems to know. But the causes of the American Revolution is one of those. And again, we have what I call a cute little saying. It rhymes. No taxation without representation. Every American knows that. Every American was taught that in grade school and high school. What caused the American Revolution? No taxation without representation. It was a legal issue. It was a policy difference, governmentally, between the Parliament in England and the colonies in America. That caused the American Revolution. In my opinion, that's an overly simplistic explanation, and I put that in the category of a proximate cause or an immediate cause. And I posit that there were more fundamental, more profound underlying causes of the American Revolution that, not that they're ignored, but are not given the credit that they're due. And as a result, we get kind of a skewed view of our revolution and the background to it. And the true, again, I say more profound causes of the American Revolution than no taxation without representation. Not that, of course, that didn't play a role. So, again, here I'm looking at a list of the 11 British measures that led to revolution. And this is the traditional story. This is the no taxation without representation story. And this is in every textbook. And here we have legislation, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, all the way down to the Quebec Act, a list of acts of Parliament. And it says here 11 British measures that led to revolution. This is the traditional story. Parliament passes laws that the colonists object to. And then revolution breaks out. A revolutionary war breaks out. That's the causes of it. Again, in my opinion, these are proximate causes. I think that there were 4 broader, deeper, more profound underlying causes of the American Revolution. 4. The first one is the results of the French and Indian War. Yeah, this is typical history stuff. Dominoes fall. One event causes the next event. The American Revolution was caused by the results of a previous rather large event, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, and it was one of a series of wars between England and France. In a 123-year struggle for supremacy between England and France from 1692 to 1815, when Napoleon's defeated, England and France vie for superpower status in the world. The American Revolution occurs within that context of that worldwide struggle between France and England. What happens as a result of the French and Indian War from 1757 to 1763 is that the English so profoundly defeat the French in North America that they, at the peace treaty in 1763, the Treaty of Paris, ending the French and Indian War, the English can order the French out of North America, where they'd been since 1607 in Canada. Again, geography, North American geography, plays an important role in the American Revolution. The French were across the Appalachian Mountains, through Quebec, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes Basin, the Ohio River Valley, and the Mississippi River Valley. That's where the French were. The English were between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains, the 13 original colonies, lined up along the Atlantic seacoast between the sea and the mountains. The French were across the mountains. And for 70 years, the French and the English fought along that Appalachian frontier in a series of wars, but even when the two countries in Europe weren't technically at war, the skirmishing along that Appalachian frontier was almost continuous. It's important to understand that the French in Canada and the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley, you can sort of think of the French holdings as Quebec to New Orleans, surrounding the English colonies. And France was a superpower. France was a powerful country. The French, however, the French Empire in America, there's a difference between the French Empire and the English Empire in America. The English Empire, the 13 colonies, that's what I'm going to call them, on the Atlantic seacoast, were always settler colonies. What do I mean by that? I mean, the English colonies in North America always encouraged settlers. They always had an open door policy to immigrants. I mean, Pennsylvania, one of them, for example, Pennsylvania is founded in the late 1600s, and almost immediately William Penn sends agents to Germany to recruit farmers, German farmers, to come to Pennsylvania. All of the 13 colonies had open doors to immigrants. Come, land's cheap, and if you go far enough west, it's free. Come, own a piece of the rock in America. The French and the Spanish Empire, the older Spanish Empire, were restrictive. They didn't let anybody in. The French Empire in America, while vast, many times larger than the English, the area by the 13 original colonies, but the area of the 13 original colonies of the United States along the Atlantic seaboard, from Maine to Georgia, between the sea and the mountains, when looked at on a map and compared to the French holdings in the interior and the vast Spanish holdings in Mexico and the Caribbean and Central and South America, look small. The 13 colonies, you got to remember, are 5 times the size of Great Britain. They're also a very large geographical area. The mountains are the dividing line between the French and the English for 70 years. In the French and Indian War, the English so profoundly defeat the French. They capture Quebec for the first time in this series of wars. That at the peace treaty table, the English can say to the French, get out. The English take over the French holdings across the mountains. The colonists, and again, let me make this point. In this series of wars between the French and the English, from 1692 to 1763, in that series of wars, it's best to think of the colonies and the English as allies. They're allied against the French. The French across the mountains are the common enemy. It holds the two together. This is the way I like to think about it. And when the English decide at the peace treaty table in 1763, based upon their decisive military victories in the war, to expel the French from Canada, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River Valley, they didn't realize, maybe they did, the English are pretty savvy, that the common enemy is gone. And not surprisingly, the alliance between England and the colonies falls apart. Both sides are like, we don't need them anymore. And from the English point of view, it's like, oh, well, let's tax them like we should, right? Let's get over there and we're going to whip these colonies into shape. We're going to make them real colonies now that we don't need them to help us fight the French. The colonists are likewise like, well, the French are gone. We don't need English fleets and English armies anymore to fight the French. The results of the French and Indian War, the expulsion of the French from North America, is an underlying cause of the American Revolution. And the English, it's interesting because, again, the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, were the dividing line between the French and the English. The British expel the French, and then in 1763, just months after the peace treaty signed, the English king draws a line across the top of the mountains called the Proclamation Line of 1763, reestablishing the old frontier between the English and the French and saying to the colonists, you can't go past that line. Now, the colonists, again, they're settlers. It's a settler society. They were constantly pushing the frontier west for more land, for more cheap land stolen from Native Americans, of course, for more free land. They're continually pushing west. When it becomes clear that the French are being expelled, the colonists are like, hallelujah, here we come, westward ho the wagons, right? And then within months, their own king reestablishes the frontier with the Proclamation Line and says, oh, no, you're not. You're not going west into the rich lands in the Ohio and Mississippi Valley. I'm keeping you out. The colonists are like, what did we just fight a series of wars for against the French if our own king is going to impose the same geographical limitations on us? Now, I know that kind of reduces the American Revolution to a real estate, a squabble over real estate. And that's, of course, what your hardcore Marxist historians say, right? Your hardcore Marxists would say, yeah, the American Revolution was just a squabble over real estate, right? And it's important to understand that some of the founding fathers, George Washington, who fought in the French and Indian War, played a prominent role in the French and Indian War. George Washington. George Washington rose to the rank of colonel during the French and Indian War in the British Army, not in the colonial militias. George Washington wore a red coat. He was a British officer. He rose to the rank of colonel, the highest ranking colonial in the British Army. And that's why, of course, he was chosen to lead the Continental Army during the American Revolution, because he had this vast experience during the French and Indian War. But there was this thing called the Ohio Company, just over the mountains, in where Pittsburgh is now. The Ohio Company, where George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, some of the other founding fathers were speculating in Western lands. They'd never seen the land that the Ohio Company claimed. They were speculating in it, claimed it. Of course, the French controlled it until the French and Indian War, and then the French are expelled. And again, it's like colonists, speculators in Western land, are like, whoa, oh man, what a good investment. The French are gone. And again, this sort of leads to this rather mercantile notion that the American Revolution was over real estate. I don't know. The results of the French and Indian War. Yeah, one of the underlying causes of the American Revolution. The common enemy is gone, and the two allies, not surprisingly, fall out. So the French are gone, and then the King of England draws the proclamation line prohibiting colonial settlement west of the line. Also what happens in 1774 is the British promulgate the Quebec Act. And again, this is just an affront to the colonists. And again, the English have been fighting wars against the French in North America for decades. The English, no one accused the English of being stupid, but the way they handle the post-French and Indian War situation, the way they handle the expulsion of the French is, well, I think kind of stupid, in that they seem to go out of their way to offend the colonies. Like the proclamation line of 1763. It seems to me that there's ways to discourage settlement west of the mountains without that, drawing that line. And the same thing's true of the Quebec Act in 1774. The English reorganize their holdings in North America, and first off, all the holdings west of the mountains and north of the Ohio River to the Mississippi, which includes Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, that whole area by the Quebec Act is moved to Quebec. It's moved to Quebec. In other words, this vast area, which according to the colonists had just become available to them, is now going to be administered out of Canada? Yes, Illinois was, according to the Quebec Act, to be part of Canada. Makes you wonder, right? Illinois and Canada. And then, not only that, but outside of that area, then west and south of that, the British set off an area called Indian Country. Indian Country. In other words, they set aside another vast area west of the mountains that used to be French America for Native Americans. Now, of course, the English colonists have no use for Native Americans, and certainly not for a huge Native American reserve. And so again, you're just trying to egg the colonists on. Again, I think that there's a certain arrogance involved in the way England handled the situation post-French expulsion. that was meant to aggravate, was meant, we've put up with you colonists because we needed you against the French. Now the French are gone, we're going to put the screws to you. And not only that, we're going to insult you. Indian country. Now again, let me say that the French Empire in North America was a fur trading empire. Very few French came to America during the years they were here to settle. Soldiers, administrators, bureaucrats, fur traders. That was the French Empire. And they entered into an alliance with Native Americans. The Native Americans harvested the furs and sold them to the French, who then sold them in Europe. It was an immensely lucrative trade, the fur trade out of North America. And the English, when they defeat the French in the French and Indian War, the English, their first thought is, oh, all right, now we have the fur trade. And that's why they drew the line, the proclamation line. And that's why they set aside this Indian Reserve area, because they wanted to protect the fur trade. Because they didn't want the settlers coming across the mountains and making the Native Americans who are harvesting their furs mad. So the the French had very good relations with Native Americans during the time they were in the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes area. And the English, after the French are gone, do a very good job of replacing the French as the friends of Native Americans. So the Native Americans, almost all of them, fought with the French in the series of wars against England, and then most Native Americans will fight for the British against the colonists in the American Revolution. And we'll come back and talk about the consequences of that. But the Quebec Act, I think, is an important consideration. So that's the first underlying cause. And that gets into geopolitics, right? Geography and history, right? What's that saying? Geography and history grew up together. The second underlying cause of the American Revolution is colonial population and economic growth. English colonial population and economic growth. And as I like to say, these weren't weak little colonies. Now again, our story of the American Revolution that is taught is that David defeated Goliath in the American Revolution. That England was the foremost military power in the world in 1776. And that these plucky little colonies somehow defeated the greatest military power in the world and gained their independence. David versus Goliath. And boy, everybody loves David versus Goliath, don't they? But that's, again, that's just not the way I see things. These weren't weak little colonies. And let me tick off some of the facts about the English colonies in, let's say, 1770 or 1775. By some measures, the British colonies of North America had the highest standard of living in the world in 1775. They were prosperous. Another historian put it that the British colonies of North America, excluding slaves, of course, had the highest median income in the world. That's the middle number of income, right? The median income. The highest median income in the world. The British colonies of North America, higher than England. They had a higher standard of living than the average Englishman. Second, the British colonies of North America had the longest life expectancy in the world in 1775. A baby born in Massachusetts or Virginia in 1775 could expect to live longer than a baby born anywhere else in the world, including England, including France. Third, the British colonies of North America had the highest literacy rate in the world before our revolution. More people could read and write in the English colonies of North America than anywhere else in the world. Now, we talked about that in a previous session when we talked about Puritanism and the Puritan fixation on literacy, that the Puritans in New England, but Puritans were everywhere in the colonies, had this thing about teaching people, even girls, how to read and write. Highest literacy rate in the world. Fourth, the colonies were technologically advanced. Usually you think of colonies, the mother country, and colonies, you think of colonies as less developed, lower on the technological ladder. Not so with the British colonies of North America in 1775. They were every bit as technologically advanced as England. And the example I like to give is the shipbuilding industry. Those full-rigged, ocean-going ships of the time were the 787s of their era. They were the height of technology at the time. And by 1775, 1/3 of the British merchant fleet, which was the largest in the world, had been built in America. The colonies had a robust, large, and important shipbuilding industry. And again, that's like some country building jet airliners today. Again, technologically advanced, the colonies. And then finally, the colonies had widespread military experience from all these wars against the French. Now, the English never tired of denigrating the colonial contribution to the wars against the French. The English were always saying, them damn colonials, you know, their militias are worthless. They come in and eat up your supplies and then run away at the first shot. And a lot of that has come over to American history. And again, not in my opinion. In my opinion, the colonies carried their weight in those wars against France. And again, you know, the English criticisms are valid. There's this famous example during the French and Indian War in Providence, Rhode Island, the harbor, that some Englishman was there during the war, and he gets up in the morning and he opens up his window of his hotel, and there's Providence Harbor, and he says he counts 7 French ships in the harbor. They're trading with the enemy, you know, blatantly trading with the enemy. So some of this English criticism is valid, but nevertheless, the colonies bore the brunt in a lot of ways of these wars, and thousands of colonists served in the wars against the French. Of course, we talked about George Washington, right? The most famous example. George Washington was heavily engaged in the French and Indian War. Thousands of colonists were. And not, you know, the British would recruit colonist militia to, like during the French and Indian War, a bunch of colonists took Cartagena in what's now Colombia. I mean, that's 1,000 miles from their homes. It wasn't just that they were in the frontier fighting the Indians during these wars, which they were mostly. The colonials served around North America in these French wars. So again, that when the Revolutionary War comes, there's a vast number of veterans. The colonists know what war is. They know what it means to be at war. It's nothing new. So again, let me point out, you know, these weren't weak little colonies. If the colonies remain united, they're a formidable military power. That's the key. That's the key to success for the colonies, to remain united, all 13 in the effort. That's key to the success of the colonists in the Revolution. The point, you know, the 4 underlying causes. We've got the results of the French and Indian War, a profound geopolitical change in North America, and number 2, these weren't weak little colonies. Again, if the 13 colonies maintain their unity, they're a formidable military, economic power. And, you know, I have a slide here of a graph of population in the New World. from 1700 to 1780. And what's the news on this graph? Look at that dramatic rise in the population of the British colonies. I mean that, and again, there's historians who are demographic determinists, right? What's the most important category of events in history? Demography, population, birth rate, migration, who lives where, how many. This is a demographic revolution in the British colonies. That's the cause of the American Revolution. So let's move on. The third, in my opinion, profound underlying cause of the American Revolution is the emergence of American nationalism. And this cause is not ignored in most textbooks. It's in just about every textbook. Every textbook mentions this development, the rise or the emergence of American nationalism. Whoa, nationalism. Whoa. What an idea. What a concept. Nationalism. The most potent ism of them all, nationalism. And there's a school of thought that the United States post-revolution was the first modern nation, was the first exhibitor of modern nationalism. We were the first modern nation, the United States. Now other historians say, no, England. England was the first modern nation. Although England didn't call itself a nation, England persisted in calling itself a kingdom. The United States called itself a nation in the peace treaty in 1783 that ended the American Revolution, or at least the American Revolutionary War, when England said, okay, you're free, you're independent. The word nation was used to describe the new entity. And wow, nationalism. I have an entire lecture on nationalism. I usually give it, I talk about it during the Civil War because the Civil War is a very crucial turning point in American nationalism in that the nation is preserved, and part of the reason the North wins the war is because the South failed to develop a viable nationalism. At least that's the way a lot of historians think about the Civil War. We'll get to that. Nationalism. Wow, what is nationalism? It's a huge concept. And I've gone down that rabbit hole. I have folders on nationalism, and it's like, what is it? And what isn't it? And I don't know if I have time to go into the details about nationalism. Just that some historians think the United States starts it. That our revolution is a nationalist revolution. And that the results, the United States of America is the first modern nation. Now, I don't know about that, possibly. I know there's that famous book by Seymour Lipset called The First New Nation about the United States, where that theory is set out. That's an old book, late 1950s. It's a famous book called The First New Nation. And let me mention here that some theories of nationalism posit the importance of literacy to the rise of nationalism. That you can't have nationalism in a nation that doesn't read, where a large percentage of the population isn't literate. You can't have nationalism. Nationalism is printed. Nationalism is mass ideas disseminated about the nation, disseminated through a large percentage of the population through reading. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, the British colonies of North America are the most literate spot in the world. So, that sort of makes sense, the first new nation. Now, again, nationalism is such a quagmire because we've come to think of nations as ethnic entities. And the United States is not an ethnic nation, right? We're a melting pot and always have been. The first modern nation was not an ethnic nation because now there's a tendency for us to think France for the French and Germany for the Germans and Albania for the Albanians. And that's how we think about nations. But that's way too simplistic. Again, I'm kind of at a loss. We'll come back, all right, to nationalism. And we'll talk more about it because there's all kinds of theories of nationalism. The fourth underlying cause of the American Revolution, in my opinion, is the tradition of American independence and unity. And again, this goes against the traditional story in some ways. Because the traditional story is that the colonies were disunited and that it was somewhat of a miracle and a feat of political genius by our founding fathers that they kept these disparate colonies together throughout the struggle with England. And it certainly is true that there were rivalries and differences, between Massachusetts and Virginia, for example, between the colonies. It's definitely true. However, the fact of the matter is that the idea that the English colonies of North America should be independent from England is not a new idea in 1776. The New England experience, again, when we talked about the Puritans in Massachusetts, we talked about the fact that from the very beginning, from 1630, if you would have said to the Puritans, "Oh, you're a colony of England," they would have said, "Well, we are not. What colony? What are you talking about?" Now, they wanted to remain subjects of the King of England. It's kind of an ambiguous position a lot of American colonists had. They wanted to remain English, but they didn't want to take instructions from England. They didn't think of themselves as subservient subunits of an empire. They never did. Massachusetts Bay never thought of itself as a colony. They always strove for at least quasi-independence. Likewise, that the 13 colonies should be united is not a new idea in 1776. It makes a better story, I guess, to say, this disparate, rivalrous, quarreling group of colonies somehow managed to stick together. No, the idea that the 13 colonies should be united in one entity, again, goes way back to the founding of the colonies. There's the New England Confederation in the late 1600s. I mean, there's the Albany Congress during the French and Indian War. There's all kinds of precedents for the idea that these colonies should be one nation, one entity. It's not a new idea in 1776. In summation, let me say that this is a bit of revisionism on my part, because I'm going against the idea of no taxation without representation was the cause, the main cause of the American Revolution. In my opinion, again, there were more profound underlying causes of the revolution that, again, in a commonsensical way, common sense, these are more important. The no taxation without representation was the proximate cause, was the excuse. If it wouldn't have been that, it would have been something else, because these profound underlying causes were playing, right, on a huge canvas, right? And the results of the French and Indian War, geopolitical change in North America, colonial strength, the rise of this thing called nationalism, which is will come to be a potent idea, and then the tradition, the long-standing tradition of colonial independence and unity. Those are the underlying causes. Thank you for joining us for this episode about the underlying causes of the American Revolution. The next episode will be about the results of the American Revolution.